Thank you all for coming today. I just took the train up here, a quick trip from D.C. There's a lot of chaos down where we are now, and everything's moving very fast. So I just wanted to thank you all for coming today, and I want to give you a quick update about what's going on within the federal government and some takeaways that you can use in your own organizations as you go back and try to defend yourselves in a fairly dangerous world of cybersecurity. And of course, this has been just a tragic week with the events in Las Vegas, and it just brings to home. I mean, when you see those kind of things, those are kinetic effects, kinetic attacks, just like we had here in New York City on 9/11. And they really hit you right between the eyes. You know, it's very, very personal in some cases. I had some friends of mine out there on the Strip that night, and it's horrific. Cybersecurity, the things that are happening there are very bad as well, but they're not really in your face like a kinetic attack. That's why our business is so important and so difficult, because I was just talking to Paul, my friend there, about engaging the C-suite, because you know, a lot of times in the cybersecurity business, we have a group of professionals. We all know what has to be done, but we have to convince the folks at the boardroom level to actually open up the checkbook and do what we think is right. And so in some sense, security has been hijacked over the years into we're doing it just because it's cybersecurity, and we've lost the fact that today we are so totally dependent on information technology just to do anything in business or any place in our mission space in the federal government. That technology is embedded. I call it, we're pushing computers literally to the edge. And the edge means everything from your dishwasher to your DVR to a medical device, a pacemaker that may go in your chest, power plants, financial systems. Those computers, the common denominator in all of this, when you cut away all of the complexity, which there's a lot of, they're all computers driven by software and firmware. And most of it, unfortunately, is not as trustworthy as we'd like it to be. So today I want to give you just a little bit of a context here on some of the things that we're seeing. This has been it's been a bad couple of years for me as far as breaches go. The first one that hit me, of course, there were a lot of them that hit me with credit card things, companies that, you know, your information's compromised, they send you a new credit card. But OPM was the first one that was really stinging for me because I have a top secret clearance. And all that SF-86 data that was sitting in OPM, that was hit in 2015. And that was I call that an intergenerational breach. That was the most sensitive information that they have on every individual that they're using to give you a top secret clearance. So you go in, maybe even polygraph information. They know everything about you. For me, it was since I was 18 years old. That's when I had my first clearance. So that was really bad. Then the second one was Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm a federal employee, so I got hit with that one as well. That was all coming right on the heels of one another. The only good news I got in 2015 was I wasn't part of the Ashley Madison breach. But I bring this up for a very important reason, because we have some very nasty adversaries out there that are trying to do harm to this country, not just for national security purposes, but for economic reasons as well. That's why cybersecurity, your business, your profession today, I don't think there's anything more important than being a security or privacy professional. Because everything we do today in that technology, totally dependent, and it has to be dependable for us to be able to survive, not just for it to work, for us to survive as a country long term. And that's really, it's a sobering thing, and there's a big burden on your shoulders. And the fact that you're here today, continuously learning, taking what you have from these great conferences, the joint conference here today, taking it back to the boardroom and trying to convince them to do the right thing. That's a heavy lift for all of us, but we have to do it, or else the future is not going to look too bright. Why are these three breaches important? Because the adversary is very clever. When you breach OPM and you breach Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield and you breach Ashley Madison, they're looking for all of those federal employees who have a top secret clearance, who maybe have embarrassing health care issues, and are cheating on their spouses. And what does that give you? That gives you a target list for espionage. Now you may think, well, that's never going to happen, all three of those, but you'd be surprised. That's a big target list, and it doesn't take a lot. So I could be sitting in a Starbucks or a Panera Bread, and someone comes up and say, hey, Ron, I just heard something about you that I don't think you're going to want to have get out, and we can make that go away if you'll give us this piece of information. or that, or do this for us. That's how espionage works. And these are the people who had the highest level clearances within the federal government. That gives you a sense of how stinging that breach was and how bad it was. So I'm a huge NASA fan. I go back to the 60s when I remember President Kennedy in his famous speech. We were behind the Soviet Union back in those days, and we were in a missile race with the old Soviet Union. And President Kennedy got up and said, we're going to go to the moon and do other things by the end of the decade, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And I bring up this Houston, we have a problem, because this is the classic thing that you always heard when something wasn't going right on that shuttle mission or the Apollo or the Gemini or the Mercury flights that go back to the 60s. So today, this is where we are. We have a problem, and I think every one of you out there understands we have a problem. The question is, what are we going to do about it? We are really good about rallying the troops after a big breach. We just did really well with the Equifax breach. That was a huge breach. Again, we're talking about it, and then our attention span goes to something else. And then we're off talking about different things, and we lose the focus on what we really want to do to get healthy. So here's the problem today. It's a physics problem. It's complexity. Now, everything you're going to learn here at the conference, configuring firewalls and doing all the things that patching systems, doing inventories, all the cyber hygiene stuff is absolutely necessary. Continuous monitoring, all the security controls, the cybersecurity framework, whatever you're using, ISO 27001, the CIS top 20 controls, whatever you're doing, keep doing that. That is really important. But the issue I want to talk about is complexity. Because those of you who are in this business and who started with maybe a technical background, computer engineering, computer science, mathematics, whatever it might be, you will understand the complexity problem. We are literally building the most complex IT infrastructure in the history of mankind. Just think about it. Operating systems with 60 or greater millions of lines of code in that OS. And on top of that, middleware. On top of that, hundreds and thousands and maybe 1 million applications now. And then all of that built on a bed of firmware and integrated circuits out to the network. One of the things I'm trying to make an argument for is we are building such a complex infrastructure that we can't even understand it, much less protect it. And that's why ultimately we're going to have to get back to good architecture and good engineering principles, foundational things that we've known how to do for a long time. I think we could have solved our cyber problems a long time ago. It's just that the technology today is so good, and you can see it, we're all guilty of it. I was in a movie with my wife about 2 years ago, and right before we don't go to a lot of movies, but we just happened to find what we wanted to go see on the big screen, and the announcer comes on right before the movie starts and said, you can download an app for your smartphone right now that will tell you the optimal time to go to the restroom in the movie you're about to see. Now, you think I'm kidding. It's called Run P. If you want to look at the Google Play Store, it's out there. Now, at NIST, it's called Run P, so you can take a look at that. So at NIST, you know, we have government smartphones, and, you know, we like to do whitelisting if we can, but whitelisting is not very popular. You guys know why, because everybody wants their favorite app like Run P. So you say, okay, at NIST, you can download apps, but they have to be mission essential. Now, the problem with that statement, if you're 25 years old and you're in the movie, that app is not mission essential, but I'm 66, so that's a mission essential application. Exactly. So that's the problem you get when you let the users be in charge of the apps, because you're going to get hundreds and we all love apps. So in some sense, we're victims of our own great technology. And we're in the Microsoft building too. We have a great IT industry, the best in the world. They produce the greatest technology, but it is complicated. And the question I have, how are we going to have the same type of security and privacy that we had in the paper-based world as we now transform to a fully digital world? Everything. What's it going to look like for our children and our grandchildren, the world of privacy and safety? That's what you are here for today. You are going to be shaping that future. And the reason why you guys get in airplanes like I do, and you get cross bridges, we have a lot of bridges in DC, and I travel a lot, so I'm always on airplanes. I get on an airplane with a high degree of confidence, and I cross bridges. Why? because they're built with good materials, a good architectural design, and skilled craftsmen that put those bridges and airplanes together. Now, do airplanes crash occasionally? Yes, bridges do fail, but they are